Sanctuary is a book based on how the Central Methodist Church in downtown Johannesburg and its controversial Bishop Paul Verryn came to offer refuge to people who have nowhere to go, some who were displaced from their homes during the 2008 xenophobic attacks. Now, Christa Kuljian is a freelance writer based in Johannesburg. In 2010, she was awarded the Ruth First Fellowship at Wits Journalism and gave the Ruth First Memorial Lecture on the refugee crisis at Central Methodist Church in Johannesburg that led her to writing the book Sanctuary, how an inner city church spilled onto a sidewalk. Today, Christa joins us here in studio. Very good morning to you, Christa. Thank you for joining us.
Good morning. Thanks for having me.
Interesting story. It was a very dark time, one would think, if one looks back at the 20 years of democracy, 2008 xenophobic attacks. Just tell us what brought you to writing this book.
Right. Well, I have lived in Johannesburg for over 20 years, worked with many NGOs, started doing more writing about social development issues, and the situation at Central Methodist caught my eye in the headlines in 2008, 2009, and I wanted to understand, how did this happen, that thousands of people were living in a church? So that's how I came to spend time there. And I learned also that the story of the church, in a way, is the story of downtown Johannesburg, looking at the city and developments in the city through the window of a particular, organization, a particular church experience.
Now, this deals with the fallout from 2008 and a sort of a sort of story that developed, or the storyline that developed out of there. What about the recent attacks that you've seen now? In your mind, are we serious about this problem? And are we putting enough in place to deal with it here in South Africa?
I think there's the misperception that perhaps issues and anger and frustration against foreign nationals was set aside after 2008, and that's not the case. It's an ongoing issue in the country. And so with the, rising again in these last weeks, people have been reminded of 2008. And I don't think there's enough being said by leadership in the country. It would be important to step up and speak out about what's happening and speak out against the violence, and especially for city leadership, police, to say this is not what we want to have carry on. It's unacceptable.
This, call it a scenario, for lack of a better word, that's played itself out in South Africa in the last decade almost now. Do you think it's changed the way that Africa views South Africa?
Well, I think that there are a lot of people across the continent who still see South Africa, Johannesburg, as the city of gold, the city of opportunity. And so even though the word may get back to them that that there isn't necessarily going to be a warm welcome, that people still see South Africa and Johannesburg as being a better option than the situation they had left at home. Many people are leaving, very difficult circumstances in their home country.
The book itself, Sanctuary, it says the name says it all. It was a sanctuary for those that were displaced at that time. These people, do they still yearn to go back to where they lived? Do they still feel that connection?
Yes, and I must say that Sanctuary is a story not only of foreign nationals who found their way to Central Methodist Church, but also South Africans. There are, significant number of South Africans who were homeless in the city, turned to the church for refuge and help, and not only accommodation. For the 14 years that Central Methodist provided its refuge, its refugee ministry, it didn't only offer housing. Every Friday night, people came together at a Friday night refugee meeting, got information about health services, information about training, information about job opportunities. It was provided, although, not always, without difficulty, provided a sense of community to many people who did not have that in the city.
You talk about this church being a kind of microcosm of the city itself. What do you mean when you say that?
Well, I say that by looking at the story and the people that have come through Central Methodist over the last 3, even 4 decades, we get a picture of how downtown Johannesburg has changed. In the 1970s, the congregation at Central Methodist was a 100% white congregation. And that started to change. We follow the story of Lindy Mjeza, who came into the city, the first black member of the congregation, who couldn't find a place to have lunch at a restaurant in downtown Joburg. So we then follow, in the 80s, people sought refuge at the church. People were working at unions and anti-apartheid organizations. In the 90s, Reverend Mvume Dandala worked a lot with people in the hostels in the city when there was ANC, IFP violence and tension in the city. Yeah. And that brought us up to the 2000s, in which issues around housing, the gap between rich and poor, and xenophobia were issues. So in that way, I see the story as telling the story of downtown Johannesburg.
The Bishop Paul Verryn is seen as controversial. Tell me about this man and his mission.
Right. Well, the church and Paul Verryn really established or offered the accommodation, opened the doors to the homeless in 2001. He had joined the church as the leader of the church in 1997. So over the years, over the 14 years that Paul Verryn offered housing in the church, it was often very controversial. Wasn't always smooth. A lot of the congregation members were not happy with that. The building took a beating in the process. Difficult issues come up when you have thousands of people living in a confined space. But Paul Verryn, I believe that he felt that he wanted to do what would Jesus have done, and he followed that in terms of never turning anyone away.
Well, thank you for joining us today. This is the book. It's called Sanctuary. You can find it in all good bookshops around South Africa. It's a fantastic story of a very difficult, dark patch in the history of South Africa. Thanks for joining us, Christa.
Thanks for having me.
Kuljian is the author.